I want you to picture the moment your entire marriage turns into evidence. Not a memory. Not a feeling. Evidence, printed, dated, stamped, and sitting in a manila folder on your kitchen island while your coffee goes cold beside it. That's where my story starts. Not with the wedding. Not with the mansion, not even with the man I thought I knew for 14 years. It starts with a folder, a notary seal from a small municipal office 6,000 miles away. And my own name, Elena Kessler, written on a property deed that, for one single, blinding moment, felt like the only true thing left in my life. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand why I didn't scream. Why I didn't throw anything. Why, instead, I picked up the phone and called a real estate attorney at 11:15 on a Tuesday night and said 4 words that changed everything. Listed this week. My husband was flying home in 12 days. He didn't know I knew. And he had no idea he was coming home to nothing. My name is Elena Kessler. I'm 41 years old. And this is the true story of how I found out my husband had secretly married another woman, and how I sold our $50 million mansion before he ever got the chance to walk through its front door again. To understand how far I fell, you need to understand how high we'd climbed. I met Julian Marsh when I was 26. He was 30, sharp-jawed, restless, the kind of man who talked about the future like it was a building he could already see the blueprints for. I was an interior architect back then. 3 years out of grad school, working on boutique hotel renovations in Chicago. Julian was raising capital for his first real estate fund. We met at a mutual friend's engagement party. And within 6 months, I had redesigned his entire life, his apartment, his pitch deck, eventually his heart, or so I believed. We married when I was 28. It was small. 70 guests, a garden ceremony in Door County. My mother cried. His mother didn't come. She and Julian had a complicated relationship I never fully understood. And I never pushed. For the first 5 years. Julian Marsh Capital was a modest firm with big ambitions and thin margins. I didn't just support him emotionally, I worked for him. Unpaid, for 2 of those years, doing design consulting for the properties his fund acquired. Staging distressed buildings so they'd sell faster. Negotiating with contractors because Julian, for all his vision, hated the granular work of construction. I gave up my own firm to do it. I told myself it was temporary, that once his company stabilized, I'd go back to my own clients. My own name on the door. That never happened. Julian's business exploded instead. By the time I was 34, Marsh Capital had gone from 3 employees to 60. From regional strip malls to luxury residential towers in 4 states. And I was still there, still designing. Still negotiating, still the invisible architecture behind a very visible man. In our 10th year of marriage, Julian bought the mansion. It sat on 11 acres outside Aspen, Colorado, a modernist compound of glass, steel, and reclaimed timber that took 2 years to build. He called it the crown, half joking, half not. I designed nearly every room myself. $50 million. And I could tell you the story behind every fixture. Every stone, every window angle chosen so the mountains would look like a painting no matter what time of day you stood there. Here is the detail that matters most. The detail my attorney would later call, quote, the single most important sentence in this entire case. When Julian bought the land and commissioned the build, he put the deed in my name. Not ours. Mine. At the time, I thought it was romantic. He told me, you built this company with me. This house is yours. I want you to have something that's untouchable. No matter what happens to Marsh Capital. I remember crying when he said it. I remember thinking I had married the rarest kind of man, one who gave rather than accumulated. I would spend the next 4 years learning exactly how wrong I was about what untouchable meant. And to whom. The first crack didn't look like a crack. It looked like ambition. Around year 11 of our marriage, Julian started expanding Marsh Capital into Southeast Asia, hotel developments in Vietnam, mixed-use towers in Manila, a resort project outside Chiang Mai. He said the returns were extraordinary, that the region was where American capital was 15 years too late and about to be 15 years too early to regret it. He traveled constantly. 3 weeks a month, sometimes more. I didn't mind. At first. I had my own project, restoring a historic hotel in Denver. My first solo commission in almost a decade. Something that felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. We were both busy, both building, and I told myself that's what a strong marriage in its second decade looked like. 2 people orbiting the same sun from different distances. But there were things I noticed and didn't name. He started taking calls in the office with the door closed. Something he'd never done before. His phone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen counter, started living in his jacket pocket, screen down. Even at home. When I asked how the Chiang Mai project was going, he'd give me answers that were technically true but strangely thin, dates without names. Numbers without context. Once, in our 12th year, I found a charge on our joint card for a jewelry boutique in Bangkok. $18,000. When I asked, he said it was a gift for a business partner's wife. A cultural custom, a relationship-building gesture in a region where personal gifts mattered more than contracts. I believed him. I want to be honest with you about that, I believed him. Not because I was foolish, but because 14 years of trust doesn't evaporate over one receipt. It erodes slowly, and you don't notice the erosion until the ground gives way. The real warning sign, the one I should have listened to, came from his mother. Julian's mother, Rosalind. And I had never been close, but in the 13th year of our marriage, she called me out of nowhere. She'd had a small stroke. Was recovering, and I think illness makes people say things they've swallowed for years. She said, "Elena, honey, I need to ask you something. And I need you to just answer me plainly. Is he still just married to you?" I laughed. I actually laughed, because it seemed like such a strange, almost senile thing to ask. I said, "Rosalind, of course. Why would you ask that?" She went quiet for a long moment. And then she said, "No reason." Forget I said anything. And she changed the subject to her physical therapy schedule. I let it go. I told myself the stroke had confused her. I didn't call Julian to ask him about it. I didn't write it down anywhere except in the back of my mind, where it sat for 11 more months. Waiting. The 18-month period before everything broke open. Julian's trips to Southeast Asia stopped being trips and started being a second life. He was gone for stretches of 5 and 6 weeks. When he came home, he was distracted. Physically present but somewhere else entirely, checking his phone during dinner. Stepping outside to take calls at 2 in the morning. Jet-lagged in a way that never quite resolved before he left again. I started managing more of Marsh Capital's domestic operations myself. Which put me, for the first time, into direct contact with the company's finance director. A meticulous woman named Priya Anand who had been with Julian since the early years. Priya and I had always had a friendly, professional relationship, and it was Priya who, without meaning to, cracked the case open. We were reviewing quarterly disbursements for a property tax dispute. And I noticed a recurring wire transfer, $12,000 a month, For the past 3 years, routed through a Marsh Capital subsidiary account to a personal account in Chiang Mai. The line item was labeled Regional Operations Housing Stipend. I asked Priya about it. Casually, the way you ask about a line item and not about your marriage. She said, "Oh, that's the household account for the Chiang Mai property. Julian set that up when he started spending so much time there." I assumed you knew. It's basically an apartment retainer. An apartment retainer. $12,000 a month, for 3 years. That's $432,000 for an apartment retainer I had never heard of. In a country I had visited exactly once. On a trip Julian described as scouting, where we'd stayed in a hotel. Not an apartment. I didn't confront him yet. I want to be honest about why I was afraid. Not of him physically, never that, but afraid of what confronting him would force me to know. There's a particular kind of denial that isn't about not seeing the evidence. It's about not wanting to be the kind of person whose life has evidence like this in it. Instead, I did what I do professionally. I researched. I found the property records for the apartment, a modest but comfortable 3-bedroom house in a residential district outside Chiang Mai. Purchased 4 years earlier under a local ownership structure required for foreigners. With Marsh Capital's Thai subsidiary listed as the financing entity. 3 bedrooms. Not one. Not a bachelor pad for a busy executive. 3 bedrooms, with a small fenced yard. In a neighborhood full of families. That detail sat in my stomach for a week before I understood why it bothered me so much. The break came on a Thursday in March. When Julian was 2 weeks into a Chiang Mai trip he'd said would last 10 days. I was in his home office looking for a signed contractor agreement he'd asked me to find for an unrelated matter, the kind of favor I'd done 1,000 times in 14 years of marriage. In the back of a locked drawer. Behind a false panel I only found because the drawer didn't sit flush. There was a small fireproof document box. I want to tell you I hesitated. I did, for maybe 30 seconds. Then I opened it. Inside was a Thai marriage certificate, dated 3 years and 4 months earlier. Registered at a district office in Chiang Mai. The groom's name was Julian Robert Marsh. The bride's name was Kanika Suthep. There were photographs. A wedding, not elaborate, but real. With flowers, with a small gathering of maybe 20 people. With Julian in a linen suit I recognized because I had packed it for one of his trips myself. There was a second document, a Thai birth certificate. For a child named Nara Marsh Suthep. Age 2. I sat on the floor of his office for what I later learned was almost 2 hours. I don't remember most of it. I remember the carpet fibers under my hands. I remember thinking, with a strange, floating clarity, that the apartment retainer wasn't a retainer at all. It was child support and a household budget for a family my husband had built in the gaps between our life. Julian Marsh had married another woman. He had a daughter. He had done this while still legally, fully, married to me, which under both Colorado and Thai law made his second marriage bigamous and void. But did absolutely nothing to make it less real to the people living inside it. I called Priya first, not Julian. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, to pull every wire transfer. Every subsidiary account, every piece of paperwork connected to the Chiang Mai operations for the past 5 years. I told her I was handling a legal matter and needed complete records by end of week. She didn't ask questions. I think, looking back, she already suspected something, the careful way she said of course. Elena told me she'd been protecting a silence of her own. Then I called my attorney, a woman named Denise Okafor, who had handled our estate planning for a decade and knew, better than anyone, the exact structure of what Julian and I owned, and more importantly, what I alone owned. Here's what Denise told me. And what I'm about to tell you. Because it's the hinge the entire rest of this story swings on. The mansion, our $50 million home in Aspen, was in my name only. Julian had put it there himself, 11 years earlier. As a gesture of love I'd once found romantic. Under Colorado law, property held solely in one spouse's name, purchased with commingled funds during a marriage, can sometimes still be considered marital property subject to division. But Denise explained something else, something Julian either hadn't understood or hadn't cared about when he set up the deed. He had also, at the time, signed a notarized quitclaim document waiving any future claim to the property. As part of a broader estate restructuring, his own tax attorney had recommended to protect the house from business liability. It was meant to shield the mansion from creditors if Marsh Capital ever collapsed. Instead, it had shielded it from him. Elena, Denise said, this house is legally yours. Fully, cleanly, unambiguously yours. You do not need his permission to sell it. You do not need to wait for a divorce filing. You do not need to do anything except decide what you want to do. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment. Because it wasn't triumph. It was grief. So total it felt like drowning. But underneath the grief, something else was forming, not revenge. Not yet. Clarity. I asked Denise one question. If I sell it now, before he's back, is that legal? She said, legal, yes. It's your property. Whether it's wise depends on what you want the next chapter of your life to look like. I thought about the 3-bedroom house outside Chiang Mai. I thought about a 2-year-old named Nara who had done nothing wrong and would grow up regardless of what I decided. I thought about 14 years of my own unpaid labor. My own abandoned firm, my own name erased from every deed and building that mattered except this one, the one house Julian had. Ironically, protected so thoroughly that it had become the one thing he couldn't touch. I didn't decide to sell the mansion out of spite. I decided because I understood, with total clarity, that I was never going back to that house as his wife. And I refused to spend one more year of my life as the caretaker of a monument to a marriage that had already ended. I simply hadn't been told yet. I listed the mansion 9 days after I found the document box. I gave the listing agent, a discreet broker named Thomas Reyes who specialized in ultra-high net worth transactions and confidentiality, one instruction: move fast, and don't let the seller's name become public until closing. What most people don't understand about $50 million properties is that they don't sell on open markets. They sell through private networks, to buyers who've been circling similar properties for years, waiting for exactly the kind of quiet, discreet listing Thomas was known for producing. Within 4 days, we had 2 offers. Within 7, an all-cash buyer, a semi-retired tech founder relocating from California, had agreed to a price of $47.5 million. With an unusually fast 30-day close, expedited further because I offered a $2 million discount in exchange for closing in 12 days instead of 30. I want you to sit with that number for a second. Because it tells you everything about how urgently I needed this to be finished before Julian came home. I gave up $2 million for 10 days. I also did something else in that window. Something I'm not proud of in the way revenge stories usually ask you to be proud. But something I don't regret. I moved every piece of furniture. Every painting, every item that was legally mine, into storage. I hired movers who worked in near silence, packing crates in a house that still smelled like the eucalyptus candles I'd bought for what I now understood had been our final Christmas as a real family. I kept nothing sentimental for Julian's return except one thing, a framed photograph from our wedding day, which I left on the kitchen counter. Exactly where the document folder about his second marriage would eventually sit. The sale closed 11 days after I found the box. Julian was still in Chiang Mai. He had no idea. Julian landed at Aspen Pitkin County Airport on a Tuesday afternoon, in the middle of a light spring snow. I know this because I was there. I picked him up myself, one final gesture of normalcy. Though not for the reason he assumed. He talked the entire drive about the Chiang Mai project's new phase. About a permitting delay, about wanting to sleep in his own bed. He said, and I remember this exactly, "God, I missed that house." I didn't say anything until we turned onto the private drive and the gate, his gate code, which I had already changed, didn't open. "What's going on?" he asked, laughing at first, assuming a glitch. I pulled the car onto the shoulder, put it in park, and told him. Not with anger, though I felt it. I told him in the same voice I'd used to deliver a project timeline, clear, sequenced, unemotional on the surface because I had spent 11 days making sure it would be. I told him I knew about Kanika. I told him I knew about Nara. I told him about the fireproof box, the quitclaim document, and the closing that had happened 4 days earlier. He didn't deny it. I want you to understand how much that told me, a man who has spent his career negotiating, persuading, reframing, didn't even attempt to reframe this. He put his head down against the steering wheel and said, "I was going to tell you. I swear to God. Elena, I was going to tell you." I asked him when. He didn't have an answer. 2 years into a second marriage and a daughter he'd hidden from me. And he still didn't have an answer for when he was going to tell me. He asked where his things were. I told him. Everything legally his clothes, his personal effects, his study materials, was in storage. And the address was in an email Denise had already sent to his attorney. Everything legally mine, the house, its contents, its proceeds, was no longer his concern. He said, quietly, almost childlike, "You sold our house." I said, "It was never our house, Julian. You made sure of that yourself. 11 years ago. I just finally understood what you'd given me." What followed wasn't a movie. There was no scene where Kanika showed up in Aspen. No dramatic public unraveling, no viral confrontation. Real consequences are usually quieter and slower than that. And often less satisfying, and I think it's important to tell you that honestly. Julian's bigamous marriage, once it became part of the legal record through our divorce filing, created serious complications for him, not criminal prosecution. Since Thai authorities didn't pursue the matter and Colorado's bigamy statute required proof he'd represented the second marriage as legitimate on U.S. soil, which he'd carefully avoided doing. But it destroyed something else. His credibility with his own investors. Marsh Capital's largest institutional backer. A pension fund that had quietly been reviewing his conduct after Priya, unable to stay silent any longer, disclosed the years of undisclosed subsidiary transfers. Pulled out $80 million in committed capital within 6 weeks. 2 smaller funds followed. Julian spent the next year fighting to keep his company solvent. A fight I watched from a careful distance. Feeling something more complicated than satisfaction, a kind of exhausted recognition that the version of him I'd built my life around had never fully existed. I don't know what happened to Kanika and Nara in detail. And it isn't my story to tell in full. I know, through Denise, that Julian continued supporting them financially. That he eventually formalized custody arrangements, and that Kanika, after everything, chose to raise her daughter in Chiang Mai rather than uproot her life around a man who had built his second family on the same foundation of quiet dishonesty he'd built his first one on. As for me, I took the proceeds from the mansion sale. alongside what remained of my share of our marital assets after 18 months of a difficult but ultimately fair divorce settlement. And I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I reopened my architecture firm. I named it Kessler and Company. My maiden name on a small brass sign outside a converted warehouse space in Denver. My first commission was the historic hotel restoration I'd started years earlier and never finished. My second commission, 6 months later, was a private residence for a client who had, ironically, heard about the woman who sold the $50 million mansion through the same discreet broker networks that had once made my old life feel so glamorous, and now made my new one feel, for the first time in years, entirely mine. People sometimes ask me, when this story comes up, whether I regret selling the house so quickly, whether I should have waited, thought it through, given myself more time before making a $50 million decision in 11 days. I've thought about that question honestly, more than once. And here's what I've come to understand. The house was never really the decision. The decision had already been made, years earlier, by Julian, every time he chose silence over honesty. Every time he built something new instead of repairing what he already had. Selling the mansion wasn't an act of anger. It was the first honest decision either of us had made about that house in over a decade, the recognition that a building, however beautiful, cannot hold together a marriage that has already quietly ended inside it. If there's a lesson in this story, it isn't about revenge, and it isn't really about money. Even though the number attached to this story is what draws people in, the lesson is smaller and harder than that. It's about paying attention to the moments you explain away, the closed office door, the mother-in-law's strange question, the apartment retainer you don't ask enough questions about, because those moments are rarely as small as we tell ourselves they are. And it's about understanding that the people who love you honestly don't need you to stop asking questions. They welcome them. I built a life once believing that loyalty meant not looking too closely. I know now that real loyalty, the kind worth building a life around, is the thing that survives being looked at closely. Anything else is just a beautiful house with no foundation underneath it. If you were in my position, if you found that document box in the back of that drawer, what would you have done? Would you have sold the house before he came home? Or would you have waited? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.